Okay, welcome back to Chapter 2. Now let's look at Section 4, Comparing Mesopotamia and Egypt. Notice the word compare. Let's start with environment and culture. Both societies depended on rivers, but they were very different. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers had very erratic and destructive flooding, but in Egypt, the Nile flooded more predictably and less destructively. And Mesopotamia was less geographically isolated than Egypt, and that meant Mesopotamia was vulnerable to external attack, while Egypt was usually protected from external attack. Now, the unpredictable and dangerous Tigris and Euphrates, this is obvious contrast to the regular and predictable Nile. And because of the isolation from invaders by the deserts around the Nile, that's in Mesopotamia actually was kind of like a crossroads between different areas, and thus saw many invasions, and that's why they were so vulnerable to attack. Now, many scholars have seen a relationship between the physical setting and the cultures that developed. The Mesopotamians had a more negative worldview, and that seems to reflect their precarious and violent environment, while the Egyptian worldview reflected the more stable, predictable, and even beneficent environment in which it took shape. So we have the pessimistic Mesopotamians and the optimistic Egyptians. And it just so happens that the dangerous geography created a pessimistic culture and a dim view of the afterlife of Mesopotamia. But the Egyptians, with their optimistic culture that expected the comfortable life cycles of Egypt, and they expected that to continue in the next life. But there is an environmental impact on the rising population in both of these areas. In southern Mesopotamia, there's deforestation, soil erosion, and even salinization of the soil weakened the Sumerian city-states that in such a way it led to foreign conquest and even the northward shift of their cultural centers. Egypt built a more sustainable agricultural system, and that contributed to the remarkable continuity of its civilization. So the environmental impact, the Mesopotamians experienced soil degradation because of overuse, but the Nile rejuvenated Egypt's soil every flood season. Now, the Mesopotamian city-states, this became a violent area, very unstable. They engaged in many rivalries and warfare. Cities rose and fell over the centuries. But in Egypt, this sustainable agricultural system that they developed led to their security, stability, even a political longevity. And that's in contrast to Mesopotamia. And in addition, the isolated and geographically coherent, and that's because of the Nile's gentle current running against the prevailing winds, Egypt enjoyed a striking security and political longevity. And what I mean by the Nile's gentle current running against the prevailing winds, again, it's a more gentle river, it's predictable, it's not as violent, and remember, it flows northward. So, and that's against the prevailing winds that are coming off of the Mediterranean Sea south into Africa. Okay, cities and states. First, let's look at the political systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt, because these were very different. Mesopotamia, we're in cities and states. Mesopotamia, for its first 1,000 years, was organized into roughly a dozen or more separate city-states. Each city-state was ruled by a king, and approximately 80% of the population lived in city-states for protection. Now, this was a crossroads between, different areas, and with the pessimistic, violent lifestyle and environment in which these people lived, they didn't want to live out in the middle of nowhere by themselves. So that's why so many lived in the city-states. They needed that protection. And the environmental devastation, the endemic warfare, ultimately led to the conquest by outside forces after about 2350 BC. And these outside powers built large territorial states or bureaucratic empires, and most of the time it encompassed all or most of Mesopotamia. In Egypt, around 3100 BCE, several of the earlier states or chiefdoms merged into a unified territory that stretched about 1,000 miles along the Nile River. And for about 3,000 years, Egypt was able to maintain its unity and independence with very few interruptions. And most Egyptians lived in agricultural villages as opposed to the city-states, and that's probably because of the greater stability and security. Now, the pharaoh, which is the ruler, and it was a god in human form, was most definitely the focus of the Egyptian state. And from 2200 to about 2000 BCE, there's anarchy. And when the state was finally restored, the pharaohs never really regained the power that they had held before. Okay, this map, I think, is helpful in getting a visual on where these two are located. As you can see, this is ancient Mesopotamia. We've talked about the Sumerians, and hopefully you've read about the Assyrians for sure. But here are some of these little city-states. Here you can see Babylon, and eventually we have a Babylonian Empire, right? Hammurabi and his code. Uruk here. You see, these are several of the different city-states. Constantly fighting, rivalries, warfare, and so these cities, they rose and they fell over time. But here, this is Lower Egypt, and of course further south we see Upper Egypt, because it's up the river, because the Nile flows north into the Mediterranean. Definitely more secure, stable, and that led to that political longevity of about 3,000 years. Okay, interaction and exchange. Egypt and Mesopotamia frequently interacted with each other. Egypt's agriculture really benefited from this interaction. Egypt also possessed the divine kingship or divine right, and that seems to have derived from the central or eastern Sudan. And of course that's a little bit further south. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt carried on extensive long-distance trade with each other, as well as other groups. The Mesopotamian sea trade with the Indus Valley civilization even as early as 2300 BC. And the Indus Valley is all the way in India. They traded with Anatolia, Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan, and Egypt traded with groups in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, as well as Nubia, which is further south than Egypt in Africa, and even along the East African coast. Now, Mesopotamia and Egypt, as they traveled along these trade routes, their cultures influenced other groups. The Hebrews migrated from Mesopotamia to Palestine and Egypt early in their history. The Phoenicians which is present-day Lebanon. Phoenicians, phonetic alphabet. Hopefully you picked up on that. But you definitely need to make sure you write this down. The Phoenicians, which is, like I said, present-day Lebanon, were commercially active in the Mediterranean basin. And they adapted the Sumerian cuneiform to an easier alphabet, which is where the Greeks get their alphabet, and of course we have an influence there as well. Hence the term phonetics, Phoenicians. Even some Indo-European peoples settled in north-central Anatolia, and that's just to the northwest of Mesopotamia and north of Egypt. And there's also sustained contact between Nubia and Egypt, and the Egyptians were active in the Mediterranean Sea basin. And their culture, even Mesopotamia's. But these two groups were also influenced by their neighbors. The Indo-Europeans brought horse and chariot-based armies to Mesopotamia, and the Indo-European group called the Hittites conquered the Babylonian Empire in 1595 BCE. Sorry, we had a little bell interruption, or announcement interruption. Beginning in approximately 1650 BCE, foreigners from the surrounding regions began to migrate into the Nile River Valley. And both the Mesopotamians and Egyptians adopted the chariot technology. Okay, sorry, we had another announcement interruption there. If I can remember where we... Okay, right here. There we go. The arrival of the Hyksos spurred further innovations in Egypt. The Hyksos were a group of Asiatic people from Asia who took over, I believe, the western part of Asia, who took over the Nile Delta, the Egyptians, and that ended that dynasty there. And so that spurred further innovations in Egypt. And by 1500, Egypt had become an imperial state, which means it was an empire. They ruled over non-Egyptian peoples, both in Africa and Asia. And there's regular diplomatic correspondence with the Middle Eastern empires. And so now you look at things like the long-distance trade. Trade connected Egypt and Mesopotamia, south to Nubia and Punt, and east to the Indus Valley in India. Their cultural influences, religious and political philosophies and ideas spread with trade, as did their social and even military practices. And the Phoenicians served as an excellent example of this process because they were such good sailors. Migrations, the rivalries, and even the diplomacy that existed between these groups. As people came into contact, as states or even through migration, obviously conflicts arose, but that, and that resulted in military engagement, but that also led to the development of diplomacy. Okay, so here's another excellent map that shows the Egyptian empire. As you can see, it's just curled along here, along the Nile River, right? And then up into Syria and Palestine, right? And this is roughly or circa 1450 BCE, and that's what I was talking about. Just right after Egypt became an imperial state, they're beginning to expand, right? And you could see up here, this is the Hittite Empire that you learned about just a little bit ago. So let's reflect on some of the things that we've learned. Civilization, that's been the key focus in this chapter. And what's in a word? Believe it or not, there's some debate on the terminology. Some scholars have reservations about the use of the word civilizations. to describe some of the cultures in this chapter. And, modern assessment of these first civilizations have revealed a profound ambiguity. They gave us inspiring art, powerful reflections on life, more productive technologies that increased control over nature with the production of agriculture, writing, but they also produce massive inequalities, social inequalities, state oppression, slavery, large-scale warfare, the subordination of women, and even epidemic disease. So many don't want to use the term civilization, right? Some critics don't believe that civilization was necessarily a good thing. And our civilization's solid. Some critics point out that there are no clear definitions of civilization or distinctions between civilized and non-civilized societies. And so that begs the question, well, what makes a society civilized, right? What makes behavior virtuous? What's accepted or even revered behavior? The term civilization implies that there are clear-cut boundaries from other societies than was actually the case. And really, aside from the elites, most of the people living in the first civilizations probably defined themselves by occupation or clan or village or city or even region, rather than a member of a larger civilization. So that's actually how we've come to study them and learn about them. In the first civilizations lacked really clear borders. Most of the maps that you see, those are estimated borders, and there's an unclear line between civilizations and other kinds of societies. But in this book and in this class, we'll continue to use the term civilization for a few reasons. Civilization, it's so deeply embedded in our way of thinking about the world. There's no alternative concept that's achieved widespread usage. And we need to make distinctions among different kinds of human communities. But in using this term, we have to remember that, historians use civilization as a purely descriptive term, designating a particular type of human society, one with cities and states, without implying any judgment or any sense of superiority or inferiority. And it's used to define broad cultural patterns in particular geographic locations, while at the same time recognizing that many people living in those regions may have been more aware of differences and conflicts than those of similarities. So now we get to look at the fun stuff, the pictures. Your visual sources for this chapter. This is a seal from the Indus River Valley. The Harappan culture. You can see there's some script at the top of the seal. It's pretty neat. This may be some type of an animal or an animal head, and this is the entire animal right here. This is a man from Mohenjo-Daro. See, look at some of the specific features of this statue. It's headband up here at the top. It's got an armband right here. Even this clothing pattern, that's pretty neat. And the facial features are rather pronounced. And we can see a beard. Is this a possible indication of what the elite status, looked like? You know, it could be from the headband or the armband. It could be from his clothing that may imply wealth. Even his beard could also be a sign of elite status. But just based on how he looks, many historians believe that this gives the impression that the statue represented an elite figure. And even the facial features and the expression represents or conveys a sense of authority or confidence even. And here we have our dancing girl. And we have two pictures of her, right, the front and the back. You know, this is from, let's see, I believe it's also from the Indus River Valley. It's actually very small. It's only a few inches tall. And I think this is bronze. And that would indicate a well-developed copper or bronze industry. I mean, look at the intricate work on here, especially on this arm right here. It's rather impressive. She is considered beautiful. Oops, sorry. She was considered beautiful as a dancer. And this position and the lack of clothing is acceptable in some public or semi-public situations. But it's a very nice piece of art, very interesting. And that is the end of Chapter 2, First Civilizations, City-States, and Unequal Societies. I hope you learned a lot, and we will continue with Chapter 3 and begin content in the classroom next week. And you have a test over Chapters 1 and 2 on Tuesday when we get back from Labor Day. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Thanks.